Now we're going to play a short video that was recorded by Lynda Gratton from the London Business School.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today on this very important topic, which is the impact of longevity on productivity. What happens, in other words, when everyone lives longer lives? I'm Lynda Gratton, and I'm the Professor of Management Practice here at London Business School. I'm the author of 2 books about aging and productivity, which I wrote with my colleague here at London Business School, Andrew Scott, who is an economist. I'm a psychologist. So let's start with the obvious demographic trends. Well, clearly around the world, people are living longer. And the simple economic truth of that is that as people live longer, so they work for longer. How long? Well, of course, that depends a great deal on your savings rate, and it also depends on how much you want to retire on, and it depends on what governments are prepared to do by way of support. But Andrew believes, and his economic projections suggest, that taking all of those things into consideration, you'd have to save a great deal of money, indeed more than 25% of your income from the time that you started working, if you wanted to retire at the age of 65. Now, I know that some people are keen to do that, but my expectation is that people will really struggle to do that. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is that people work for longer. How long? Probably 70s, mid-70s is going to be where we think it's going to play out. Now, at the same time as people living longer, the demographic trends are not the only trend that's shaping our world. The other trend is really about technology. And what we know is that right now across the world, in China, in Japan, particularly big investments in technology, both in terms of a technology that replaces muscles in terms of robots and factory technologies and so on, but also technology that replaces our brain in terms of cognitive artificial intelligence. So what we're saying is that not only are we living longer, but we're also living at a time of extraordinary technological developments. And of course, our shared experience of the pandemic has simply served to reinforce the fact that we are able to use digital capacities to get our job done. We're now so familiar with speaking with each other on Microsoft Teams or on Zoom. These have really accelerated our digital understanding. So where are we? Well, what we know is that people are going to live longer, they're going to work longer, and they're going to work at a time of extraordinary technological developments. What's that going to mean? Well, particularly in terms of technology, what it means is that the agenda to upskill and reskill right the way through your life is absolutely at the front of many people's thoughts about their own lives. And indeed, it's crucial for corporations and for governments. And we've seen only recently a number of large organizations coming out and saying, we're making huge investments in upskilling and reskilling our employees. We saw that just recently with Bosch, one of the German engineering companies, saying that they were going to spend 2 billion euros on upskilling their employees. Now, at the same time as this aging phenomena, we're also seeing family size decreasing very rapidly, China and Japan particularly so. What does that mean? Well, we all know that means that a population ages, and it also reduces unless you have significant immigration. So that's why I think it's so important that this conference talks about productive aging, the idea that, you know, people in their 60s are still productive, people in their 70s can still work. So how are they going to do that? Well, let me really talk about how I see that developing and what it means for the way that individuals, corporations, and governments go about supporting productive aging. Well, from the first thing I would say is that when you believe you're going to live to 100 or potentially around that, then the normal 3-stage working life, which has been the traditional way that we've imagined our life, which is full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement, is obviously disappearing. That's very inflexible. It's not going to allow you to work into your 70s. So what comes in its place? Well, what comes in its place is something that you can call the multi-stage life. And by that, I mean that people move from one stage to another. So rather than 3 stages, education, work, retirement, those all break into smaller stages, which then move right across your life. Let me give you an example of what are in those stages. One would be, for example, starting your own business. We can see, particularly in developed countries, a huge emphasis now on people starting their own business, but particularly those over 50. So we could imagine that at any stage in their life, people are going to want to be entrepreneurs and start their own business. The second could be that people engage in social enterprise, where they either work in a charity or a not-for-profit to really give back at some stage in their life. Or thirdly, we can imagine people having a portfolio where they perhaps do some paid work and some unpaid work. These multi-stage lives are very different from 3-stage lives. And they're different in a couple of very significant ways. One is, of course, there are more stages, more things for people to do. And as a consequence of that, there are more transitions. You know, the interesting thing about the 3-stage life is there's only 2 transitions, from education to work and then from work to retirement. In a multi-stage life, there are many transitions. And whereas in a 3-stage life, you would be making those transitions in lockstep with other people, in a multi-stage life, you're often making those in a much more independent way. So your own personal agency becomes more important. So how do people make those transitions? Well, what we know is that as we move into productive aging and we move into thinking about these multiple transition points, that self-knowledge and agency becomes much more important. So we expect people, as they think about living long, productive lives, to be much more aware of their needs and their aspirations, and much more able, in a sense, to imagine what the possible selves of their life could be, what they could be in the future. The second thing we might think about with regard to more transitions is the idea that there will be more changes in identity. You know, if you work for a large corporation and retire at the age of 65, you've just got one identity. You've got the identity of a person working in a large company, and then you've got the identity of a retired person. But actually, in a multi-stage life, each stage has an identity associated with it. So, for example, being an entrepreneur has a different identity than working in a large organization full-time, or even from having a portfolio. Another fascinating aspect of these different identities at different stages in your life is that your networks change. So what we know is that people who make successful transitions are much more likely to also change their networks. When they become entrepreneurs, they move into entrepreneurial networks. When they become volunteers, they move into volunteer networks. And so these are much more fluid life stages. So what's the role of the corporation in this? Well, I would say 2 things really in terms of productive living and work. The first is that corporations right now are ageist places. And that's not true for all, but it's true for many. It's very difficult to work in a large organization over the age of 60. Companies want you out at 65. They have very traditional, old-fashioned views about what it is to be in your 60s or 70s. And as a consequence of that, lots of people leave the labor market in their 60s because they don't feel as if they have a role to play in a large corporation. And so the first thing that's going to be crucial is that we really tackle this idea of ageism. The second thing that's very important is organizations create flexibility so that people can move in and out of work at different stages in their life, which in many companies now is extremely difficult. But they're also more flexible about how and when people work. I wrote with Andrew Scott, the 100-Year Life book, about 5 years ago. And by the way, by then I wasn't particularly positive about the ways in which companies could change, or indeed society could change. I saw companies still being pretty inflexible about aging, the aging workforce, and I also saw quite a lot of ageism. I want to say something about the impact of the pandemic, which I believe has created enormous opportunities for older people to work longer. Now, right now, that's not the case, by the way. And right now, we know from the pandemic that a high proportion of older people decided not to go back to work. They just couldn't face it. But I don't think that's a long-term view. I think over time, older people will want to stay and work. Why will they do that, and what's going to change? Well, the first thing is that as organizations moved from office-based work to home-based work during the COVID pandemic, they began to realize that people could work just as productively at home. And they also realized that they could start changing the timing in which people worked. This is just the flexibility that people who live multi-stage lives really need. The second thing that's been very interesting about the impact of the pandemic is what is happening now across most developed countries is what we're calling the Great Resignation. People are resigning from organizations, particularly younger people. And what I think that's doing is to really help corporations realize that they are in a war for talent. And if they only just look for young people, that's not going to help them. They also have to look for older people as well. I think that the idea of hybrid work, where we could work from home as well as the office, is going to be very helpful for productive aging. And here's why. Because we know that when people work from home, they spend less time commuting, they're more likely to exercise, they spend more time eating good food, good home-based food, and they spend more time in their neighborhood. And we know that each one of those is very important for productive aging. So I'm very excited about the opportunities that hybrid work brings for productive aging. And so what I'd like to really finish by is saying that we are still in a journey, both in terms of understanding how people age, but also understanding how work itself will change. I think we have an astounding opportunity right now to encourage people to work into their 60s and their 70s. And that means helping them change the way they think about work and they think about their own identity. I think we've also got a fantastic opportunity to encourage corporations to be more flexible about the way they work, to be more appreciative of the sort of knowledge and wisdom that older people have, and really to support people of all ages to be as productive as they can be. As we think about productive aging, work plays an incredibly important role in that. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you about that today. Thank you.